The night his daughter stopped breathing, the only person in the hospital who knew what to do was the man everyone there treated like he didn't exist. Years later, Daniel Mercer still remembered the sound first. Not the alarms. Not the shouting. Not even his daughter choking for air. What stayed with him was the squeak of a mop while turning slowly across the emergency room floor while everyone else panicked. The old janitor had looked up once. Just once. And in that single glance, Daniel saw something he hadn't seen in most doctors that entire night. Control. At the time, Daniel didn't understand why that terrified him. He would later realize it was because the calmest person in the room was the one nobody had bothered learning the name of. And somehow, that felt wrong before he even knew why. By the winter of 2018, Daniel Mercer had become the kind of hospital administrator who measured his life in schedules, liability reports, and unanswered emails. At 46, he managed operations at St. Vincent Regional Medical Center, a large hospital sitting just outside Columbus, Ohio. The building never slept. Neither did Daniel. Most mornings started before sunrise. Coffee in a paper cup, half a bagel eaten while walking, 3 people talking to him at once. Someone always needed something. A nurse requesting additional staff. A surgeon angry about operating room delays. A family threatening legal action. Insurance calls. Budget meetings. Maintenance failures. Every hallway carried urgency. Every room carried exhaustion. Daniel used to think hospitals were places built around healing. After 20 years inside them, he understood they were really built around endurance. People survived the work by becoming emotionally selective. You learned what deserved your attention, and more importantly, what didn't. The janitor belonged to the second category. His name was Elliot, though most people rarely used it. They called him Ghost. It started because he moved quietly. He appeared suddenly in hallways. He never interrupted conversations. Never defended himself. Never complained. Tall but slightly bent forward. Gray hair thinning unevenly. Large tired eyes behind thick glasses. Always pushing the same faded cleaning cart. He worked evenings mostly. Long shifts. The invisible hours. Daniel first noticed him near the surgical wing. A resident physician had been complaining about budget cuts while Elliot cleaned a spill nearby. The resident stepped backward without looking and bumped into the mop bucket. Water splashed onto his shoes. The young doctor laughed. Well, Ghost strikes again. 2 nurses nearby smirked. Not maliciously, just automatically. Elliot apologized softly, even though it clearly wasn't his fault. Daniel remembered feeling uncomfortable. Not enough to say anything, but enough to remember it. That was the strange thing. Most workplace cruelty didn't look dramatic. It looked casual, routine, like something people stopped noticing. Over the next few months, Daniel started seeing it everywhere. Cafeteria workers serving everyone else first while Elliot waited patiently with his tray. Residents talking around him as if he weren't standing there. Security guards nodding to surgeons, but not to him. Small things. Easy things. The kinds of humiliations people convince themselves don't matter. Elliot never reacted. That almost made it worse. There was something unsettling about a person who seemed fully accustomed to being overlooked. Daniel occasionally crossed paths with him late at night, usually during rounds through the building. And every once in a while, something strange happened. A nurse would mention a patient issue before a physician noticed it. Elliot would quietly suggest checking oxygen flow, and somehow he'd be right. Or a resident would prepare equipment incorrectly. Elliot would pause beside the doorway and say something simple like, "You may want a larger catheter for that line." Always calm. Always polite. Never pushy. The first few times, people brushed it off. Then Daniel began noticing how often Elliot was correct. One evening, Daniel walked past Trauma Room 3 and overheard an argument between 2 surgical residents. They were debating medication dosage during a chaotic intake. Elliot was replacing a trash liner nearby. Without looking up, he quietly said, "She's under 90 pounds. You'll crash her pressure if you push that fast." Silence followed. One resident stared at him, annoyed, but the other checked the chart. and adjusted the dose. Daniel waited for someone to ask the obvious question. Nobody did. People simply moved on. Later that night, Daniel found himself standing beside Elliot at the vending machines. The older man held $2 in quarters in his palm, studying the snack options carefully. "You used to work medical?" Daniel asked casually. Elliot glanced at him. For a second, Daniel saw surprise. Almost suspicion. "Long time ago," Elliot answered. "What did you do?" Elliot gave a small shrug. "Mostly cleaned up messes." Then he picked peanuts from the machine and walked away. Daniel watched him disappear down the corridor. Something about the answer bothered him. Not because it sounded mysterious, because it sounded practiced. Like a sentence repeated enough times that it stopped hurting. Still, Daniel let it go. Life stayed busy. Hospitals didn't leave much room for curiosity. At home, things were becoming complicated too. His divorce from Claire had finalized 8 months earlier. They spoke politely now, mostly through text messages about schedules involving their 10-year-old daughter, Lucy. Lucy had inherited Claire's sharp eyes and Daniel's habit of overthinking everything. She also had severe food allergies. Peanuts, cashews, several oils. The hospital irony never escaped Daniel. He spent his career managing emergencies while living in constant fear of one at home. That December, a winter storm warning rolled across Ohio. Schools prepared closures. Road crews salted highways. The news stations started using phrases like historic system and dangerous conditions. Daniel barely paid attention. Hospitals stayed open no matter what the weather did. The custody issue started that same afternoon. Claire's mother had been hospitalized unexpectedly in Cincinnati. Claire needed to leave immediately. Their usual childcare plans collapsed. "I'll pick Lucy up after work," Daniel told her over the phone. "You sure?" "I'll make it work," Daniel said. But work rarely cooperated. By 6:30, emergency admissions had already increased from weather-related accidents. 2 nurses called out due to road conditions. An elderly patient coded in cardiology. And Lucy sat inside Daniel's office coloring quietly while he handled calls. She didn't complain. That somehow made him feel worse. Around 8 that night, Daniel walked her downstairs toward the cafeteria to find dinner. Most options were already limited. The storm had disrupted deliveries. Lucy picked grilled cheese and soup. Daniel grabbed coffee. As they sat near the far windows watching snow bury the parking lot, Elliot moved slowly between empty tables with a broom. Lucy noticed him first. "Why does he always look sad?" she asked softly. Daniel glanced up. Elliot pretended not to hear. "I don't know," Daniel answered. Lucy watched the old man another moment, then waved. Elliot paused, surprised again. After a second, he waved back. It was such a small thing. But Daniel would remember it later with painful clarity, because that might have been the first time anyone acknowledged Elliot all day. Outside, the storm kept getting worse. And somewhere deep inside the hospital, long before anyone realized it, something else had already begun. By 9:15, St. Vincent Regional was running on backup stress. Not backup generators yet, just the emotional version. Every department had crossed the line from busy into unstable. Ambulances arrived faster than rooms emptied. Road accidents increased with the ice. Families crowded hallways. Phones rang endlessly. Then the power flickered. Once. Twice. The entire hospital dimmed for 2 seconds before emergency systems kicked in. A collective silence passed through the building. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Everyone understood the night had changed. Daniel immediately moved into crisis mode. He coordinated with maintenance. Checked generator systems. Reviewed staffing shortages. Lucy stayed in his office upstairs with blankets and an old tablet. He hated leaving her alone, but had no choice. At around 10:30, one of the elevators failed. Then another. Emergency surgeries continued. Portable equipment filled corridors. Patients overflowed into recovery areas. The storm outside became violent enough that visibility disappeared entirely beyond the windows. Daniel barely noticed the hours passing, until Lucy called him. Her voice sounded wrong immediately. Tight. Short. Dad, my throat hurts. Daniel froze. Every parent of an allergic child learns certain tones. That one lived permanently inside his nervous system. He reached his office in less than a minute. Lucy sat curled in the chair beside his desk, her skin already reddening, hands trembling. What did you eat? He asked with fear and trembling. The soup, Lucy answered, almost gasping for breath. Daniel grabbed the ingredient label from the cafeteria tray. The soup contained peanut oil. Someone had placed the wrong card beside the container. His stomach dropped. Lucy's breathing changed. A sharp whistle. Daniel reached for the EpiPen in her backpack. Empty. The second injector was downstairs in his car, buried somewhere beneath snow and ice. For one terrible second, his mind stopped functioning. Not entirely. Just enough. Later, he would hate himself for that moment. Because administrators were trained for emergencies. Parents were supposed to protect their children. And somehow he became neither. He called for help. Shouted into the hallway. People moved instantly. Nurses rushed in. Someone called respiratory. Another searched for medication. Lucy's lips began turning pale. The room filled quickly. Too quickly. Voices overlapped. Orders collided. Machines arrived. And Daniel stood in the center of it, unable to think clearly. Then Elliot appeared. Nobody noticed him enter. 1 second he wasn't there. The next he stood beside the doorway holding latex gloves. But something about him had changed. The nervous hesitation was gone. His shoulders straightened. His eyes sharpened. He looked at Lucy once. Then at the monitor. Then directly at the nurse preparing medication. How long since onset? Elliot asked. The nurse blinked. What? She was surprised. How long? Elliot yelled in urgency. Maybe 4 minutes. The nurse answered. She's crashing faster than that. Airway first. Elliot said. The tone of his voice silenced the room. Not loud. Not aggressive. Certain. Daniel stared at him. Elliot moved toward Lucy calmly. Sweetheart, stay with me, all right? Lucy nodded weakly. A resident physician stepped forward. Annoyed. Sir, you can't be in here. Elliot ignored him. Where's the pediatric intubation tray? He asked. Nobody answered immediately. Because somehow everyone had realized the same impossible thing. The janitor knew exactly what he was talking about. One nurse hurried toward storage. Lucy gasped suddenly. A horrible sound. Half breath. Half choke. Daniel felt pure panic flood his chest. Elliot looked directly at him. Mr. Mercer. Not Daniel. Not administrator. Mr. Mercer. You need to stay calm, so she stays calm. Daniel hated that those words worked. But they did. Elliot knelt beside Lucy, checking pulse, watching her airway. His hands moved with frightening familiarity. The resident spoke again. Security needs to remove. Before that statement was complete, Elliot spoke. She needs epinephrine now, Elliot snapped. The entire room stopped. Because underneath the exhaustion and age and janitor uniform, there it was. Authority. Real authority. The kind built over years of life and death decisions. Not rank. Not title. Instinct. Medication arrived. Lucy convulsed slightly as the injection hit. Still struggling. Still deteriorating. The lights flickered again. Emergency systems hummed louder. Daniel remembered the snow slamming against the windows. The sound of distant alarms. The smell of antiseptic and melted winter coats. And Elliot's voice cutting cleanly through all of it. Bag valve. Slow breaths. Don't overpush. The resident assisting ventilation adjusted immediately. Without argument this time. Minutes stretched strangely. Lucy's oxygen numbers stabilized slightly. Then dipped. Then climbed again. Elliot never lost focus. At one point, he quietly asked for a smaller airway tube before anyone else realized the swelling had changed. He was right again. Daniel noticed something terrifying. The nurses had started listening to him automatically. Not because they understood why. Because competence has a language people recognize before they consciously process it. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was probably 12 minutes, Lucy's breathing eased enough for transfer to pediatric ICU. The room exhaled collectively. Daniel nearly collapsed. Elliot removed his gloves slowly. His hands trembled now. Only now. As if adrenaline had finally released him. One of the younger nurses stared at him. "How do you know all this?" Elliot looked suddenly exhausted. He avoided her eyes. "Long night," he muttered. Then he walked out. Just like that. No dramatic exit. No explanation. He simply disappeared back into the hallway carrying a trash bag. And somehow that unsettled Daniel more than anything else. Because a man capable of saving his daughter should not have been invisible. But somehow he was. And Daniel realized with growing shame that he had helped make him that way. Lucy recovered overnight. By morning, color had returned to her face. Her breathing normalized. She slept most of the next day while snow continued burying the city outside. Doctors assured Daniel she would be fine. But Daniel barely heard them. His mind stayed fixed on Elliot. Not just what happened. How it happened. The precision. The confidence. The speed. Nobody learns that accidentally. Daniel spent the next 2 days trying to focus on hospital recovery operations after the storm. But curiosity kept pulling him sideways. He started small. Human resources records. Elliot Hayes. Age 68. Custodial staff. Employed 8 years. No emergency contacts listed. No disciplinary issues. Minimal personal information. Before that, gaps. Large ones. Daniel dug deeper. And eventually found an old newspaper archive. The photo hit him first. A younger Elliot standing beside an operating table during a hospital fundraising event 15 years earlier. Except back then, he wasn't Elliot the janitor. He was Dr. Elliot Hayes, Chief of Trauma Surgery at St. Vincent Regional. Daniel stared at the screen for a long time. The article described him as brilliant, innovative, respected nationally for emergency surgical response. There were awards, conference lectures, teaching commendations. One quote from a former colleague described him as the kind of surgeon who made impossible situations survivable. Daniel leaned back slowly. Outside his office window, snow melted from the parking structure in gray sheets. He tried imagining the quiet janitor inside the man from the photographs. It seemed impossible, until it didn't. Suddenly everything made sense. The instinct, the knowledge, the calm. Daniel kept reading. Then he found the lawsuit. 14 years earlier. Massive highway collision during an ice storm remarkably similar to the recent one. Multiple fatalities. Overwhelmed emergency departments. Equipment failures. Staff shortages. One patient died during emergency surgery. A 16-year-old girl. The media coverage afterward became vicious. Headlines questioned surgical decisions. Talk shows debated negligence. Grieving parents demanded accountability. Though internal reviews later concluded the situation had been nearly impossible, public damage spread faster than facts. Dr. Hayes became the face of the tragedy. Daniel opened another article. Photographs showed reporters surrounding Elliot outside the courthouse. His face looked hollow already. The lawsuit settled quietly, but the hospital distanced itself from him afterward. Officially, nobody fired him. Unofficially, his career collapsed. Daniel learned more through older staff members. People who spoke carefully, as though discussing a ghost story. He started drinking after that. One retired nurse told him over coffee. Another said, he blamed himself even after everyone else stopped. A former anesthesiologist shook his head slowly. He was one of the best surgeons I ever saw. Then one bad year swallowed his whole life. Daniel eventually found the final piece through an old personnel manager. Elliot's medical license had been suspended after alcohol dependency issues several years later. His wife left shortly after. Moved out west. No children. No known family nearby. What happened after that? Daniel asked. The manager sighed. He disappeared for a while. Rehab, I think. Then he came back looking for work. And we hired him as a janitor? The older woman gave Daniel a tired look. He needed insurance. Needed stability. Maintenance had openings. She paused. To be honest, most leadership back then preferred having him somewhere invisible. That sentence stayed with Daniel all night. Somewhere invisible. As if shame needed storage. As if human beings could be hidden like broken equipment. Daniel started noticing Elliot differently after that. Not with pity exactly. Something heavier. One evening, he found Elliot alone in the cafeteria drinking coffee from a paper cup. The room was mostly empty. Snow still lined the windows. Daniel sat across from him. Elliot looked mildly uncomfortable. "How's your daughter?" he asked. "She's okay." Elliot nodded once. Silence settled. Finally Daniel said, "You were a surgeon." Elliot's eyes stayed on his coffee. "Long time ago. You saved her life." "No." Elliot shook his head gently. "The team saved her life." Daniel almost argued, but stopped, because he recognized something familiar. A man trying carefully not to stand too close to his former identity. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Daniel asked. A faint smile crossed Elliot's face. "People knew once." "That's not what I mean." Elliot looked toward the dark cafeteria windows. "You spend enough years being remembered for your worst day," he said quietly. "Eventually you stop introducing yourself." Daniel felt something tighten painfully in his chest. Not guilt alone. Recognition. Because hospitals praised people when they were useful, then erased them when they became complicated. And maybe that wasn't limited to hospitals. A few days later, Daniel witnessed another small moment. A young resident snapped at Elliot for mopping near a supply station. The tone wasn't openly cruel. Just dismissive. Impatient. Elliot apologized automatically. Daniel interrupted before he could stop himself. "He's fine," Daniel said firmly. The resident looked surprised. Embarrassed. Afterward, Elliot approached quietly. "You didn't need to do that." "Maybe I did." Elliot studied him carefully. Then he said something Daniel would never forget. "People are kinder to broken things when they think they're temporary." Daniel stared at him. Elliot continued wiping down a counter. "But when they realize the damage is permanent." He gave a small shrug. They stopped looking. That night Daniel sat beside Lucy's hospital bed long after she fell asleep. Machines beeped softly around them. Snow reflected pale blue through the windows. And for the first time in years, Daniel thought about all the people he passed every day without really seeing. Not just janitors. Everyone. The exhausted nurse hiding panic. The aging receptionist speaking less each year. The widower delivering cafeteria supplies overnight. Invisible people. The hospital functioned because of them. Yet somehow dignity inside the building followed hierarchy more than humanity. Daniel realized something uncomfortable. Nobody at St. Vincent had truly discarded Elliot all at once. They had done it slowly. Over years. Which somehow made it worse. And deep down, Daniel knew the story still wasn't finished. Because storms rarely ended cleanly. And neither did regret. If you've made it this far into the story, take a second and comment where you're watching from. Stories like this always remind people how similar human pain can feel no matter where we live. And if you enjoy deeply human stories about redemption, hidden pasts, and the quiet moments that change people forever, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this coming every week. Now back to the story. Over the next month, Daniel's routines changed in ways he didn't fully notice at first. He started staying later, walking slower through corridors, paying attention. The hospital looked different once he stopped moving through it like a machine. He noticed how tired everyone seemed. Not dramatic exhaustion. The quieter kind. The kind people carried so long it became part of their posture. Elliot remained difficult to approach. Whenever Daniel tried thanking him again for helping Lucy, the older man redirected the conversation immediately, usually toward maintenance issues or weather. It wasn't modesty. It felt more like survival, as if recognition itself had become dangerous. One night, Daniel brought him coffee during an overnight shift. Elliot accepted it cautiously. "You keep doing this," he said. "Doing what?" "Talking to me." Daniel laughed softly. "That's a pretty low bar." "Not around here." The honesty in the answer landed heavily. They sat together near the ambulance entrance while snow melted off passing tires. For a while neither spoke. Then Elliot surprised him. You know the hardest part? Daniel looked over. Of losing everything. Elliot continued. Daniel waited. It's not the humiliation. Elliot rubbed his hands together slowly. It's watching people become careful around you. Like disaster might spread by proximity. Daniel thought about old colleagues avoiding difficult conversations. Avoiding aging physicians. Avoiding lawsuits. Avoiding grief. Humans liked controllable suffering. The kind with clear lessons. Elliot represented something worse. Random collapse. A good man destroyed by one impossible night. That possibility frightened people. Over time, Daniel learned more fragments. Elliot still attended AA meetings twice a week. He rented a small apartment above a laundromat. He spent holidays alone. Yet despite everything, he still remembered former patients by name. One evening, while replacing hallway light covers together during a maintenance delay, Elliot pointed toward a framed hospital photo from years earlier. That little boy survived a ruptured spleen, he said. Daniel looked closely. The child in the photograph was probably 30 now. You remember him? Elliot nodded. He wanted to become a firefighter. And did he? I don't know. The answer carried quiet sadness. Not because Elliot expected gratitude. Because medicine had once connected him to people. Now he mostly watched them pass by. Meanwhile, the hospital itself kept changing. Budget meetings intensified after storm damages. Staff shortages worsened. Morale declined. And underneath, everything lingered exhaustion. Then came the second emergency. The storm aftermath caused a 40-car highway collision north of the city. Black ice. Low visibility. Fuel fire. Ambulances began arriving just after midnight. Daniel was already in the building when trauma alerts exploded across every department simultaneously. The emergency room transformed instantly. Stretchers flooded corridors. Blood supplies ran low. Communication systems overloaded. Young residents looked terrified. Daniel felt the same helpless pressure returning. Only this time he noticed something else. Elliot standing near the trauma bay doors. Watching. Not interfering. Assessing. One patient arrived with severe chest trauma. Another with arterial bleeding. A third coding during transfer. The attending trauma physician was stuck 30 minutes away due to icy roads. Chaos spread quickly. Then Elliot stepped forward. Again, not dramatically, just decisively. Move bed 4 into imaging 2, he told a nurse. Separate walking wounded from incoming trauma, or you'll block intake. People obeyed before fully realizing why. Because the instructions made sense. Immediately, Daniel watched the emergency department reorganize around him almost unconsciously. Elliot directed supply movement. Prioritized treatment order. Spotted complications before monitors did. A resident attempted chest decompression incorrectly. Elliot corrected hand placement in 2 seconds. No speeches. No spotlight. Just competence. At one point a young surgical resident named Priya stopped mid-procedure and stared at him. "You're Dr. Hayes," she whispered. The room around them kept moving. But something shifted. Recognition. Elliot didn't answer immediately. Finally he nodded once. Priya looked stunned. "My professor used to show us your trauma protocols in med school." Nearby nurses glanced over. Confused. Then slowly understanding. Daniel saw embarrassment crossing several faces. Not dramatic shame. Something quieter. The realization that they had spent years dismissing someone extraordinary because his life no longer looked impressive. Still, Elliot never acted vindicated. If anything, he seemed uncomfortable. When the attending trauma physician finally arrived, he paused mid-stride after seeing Elliot coordinating intake. For one strange second, the older doctor looked emotional. Then he simply said, "Good to have you back tonight." Back. Not janitor. Not ghost. Back. The emergency lasted until dawn. 3 patients went into surgery. 2 were airlifted. Several stabilized. 1 died. Hospitals never allowed fully happy endings. That was part of their honesty. By 6 in the morning, the halls quieted again. Exhausted staff leaned against counters drinking stale coffee. Elliot sat alone near the supply room, removing blood-stained gloves from his hands. Daniel approached carefully. "You should have never been forgotten," he said. Elliot smiled faintly. "That happens to everybody eventually." "No, not like this." Elliot looked toward the trauma base. "You know what age does?" he asked softly. Daniel waited. "It teaches you how conditional most attention is." He folded the gloves slowly. "When people stop needing what you used to be." He shrugged. "They stop asking who you are." Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to promise things would change. But adulthood had taught him the danger of emotional promises made during exhausted nights. So instead he sat beside him quietly. And for the first time since his divorce, since the endless years of work consuming everything human inside him, Daniel felt fully present in a moment. Not solving, not managing, simply seeing another person clearly. It felt strangely painful and necessary. Word spread quietly after the highway accident. Not publicly. Hospitals protected themselves too carefully for that. But internally, people started looking at Elliot differently. Nurses greeted him by name. Residents stopped making jokes. A few older physicians approached him with cautious warmth. Daniel noticed the change immediately. One afternoon, Daniel found him replacing paper towels in the surgical wing restroom. The same work, the same cart, but now two residents passing by nodded respectfully. Elliot waited until they left before speaking. "They'll forget again," he said. Daniel leaned against the doorway. "You really believe that?" Elliot continued refilling dispensers. "I believe people prefer simple stories." He closed the cabinet gently. Hero, failure, success, ruin. Then he looked up. But most lives become all of those eventually. Daniel thought about his own life. The marriage he failed to protect. The daughter he almost lost because work consumed his attention. The employees he overlooked. Maybe Elliot was right. Humans simplified each other because complexity demanded empathy. And empathy required energy people rarely had left. A week later, Lucy returned to visit the hospital after school. She carried a small paper bag. "I made him cookies," she whispered. Daniel almost laughed at the irony. "No peanuts this time." She rolled her eyes. "I'm not 5. They found Elliot polishing floor rails near pediatrics. Lucy handed him the bag shyly. "For helping me." Elliot looked genuinely startled. His eyes watered slightly though he smiled. "Well," he said carefully, "that seems unfair." "Why?" Lucy asked. "Because I didn't make you cookies when you helped me." Lucy frowned. "When did I help you?" Elliot looked at her for a long second. "The night you waved at me in the cafeteria?" Silence followed. Daniel felt something crack quietly inside him. Because he understood suddenly. For Lucy, the wave meant nothing. Simple kindness. Childlike instinct. But for Elliot, a man invisible for years, maybe it mattered more than anyone realized. Sometimes dignity returned through tiny doors. Over the next month, Daniel pushed quietly for changes inside the hospital. Nothing dramatic. Recognition programs that included custodial staff. Cross-department lunches. Training conversations about workplace culture. Small corrections. He understood systems rarely transformed overnight. But neglect happened through accumulation. So maybe dignity could return the same way. Not everyone changed. Some people never would. But enough did. And still, Elliot remained strangely distant. Almost as if he knew something Daniel didn't. Then one Monday morning, he didn't show up. No call. No message. Daniel checked with staffing. Nothing. A strange anxiety settled over him. By afternoon, he found a sealed envelope waiting inside his office mailbox. No return address. Just his name. Inside was a typed resignation letter. Brief. Professional. Effective immediately. Attached was a handwritten note folded separately. For Lucy. Daniel drove to Elliot's apartment that evening through freezing rain. The building manager said he'd moved out that morning. No forwarding address. Gone. Daniel sat in his car for a long time afterward, watching rain slide across the windshield. He realized then that part of him expected redemption stories to end with restoration. The old surgeon returning triumphantly. Recognition. Celebration. But real life rarely repaired itself so neatly. Some wounds healed crooked. Some people kept moving because staying hurt too much. Back home that night, Lucy opened the note carefully. The handwriting shook slightly. "Thank you for finally seeing me." That was all. No long goodbye. No explanation. Daniel read the sentence 3 times, then handed the note back silently. Years later, he would still think about Elliot whenever he walked through hospitals. Not just because the man saved his daughter, but because he exposed something uncomfortable about human nature. How easily compassion becomes tied to status. How quickly suffering turns invisible when it lasts too long. How often people are valued only for what they can still produce. Daniel eventually left hospital administration. Not dramatically, just gradually. He started teaching healthcare ethics part-time. Spent more evenings with Lucy. Learned how to sit still again. Sometimes during lectures he told students a version of Elliot's story. Never the full details. Just enough. Enough to remind future doctors and administrators that every building contains people carrying histories nobody sees. The quiet janitor. The tired receptionist. The older nurse moving slower than she once did. Invisible people. And every now and then, usually during winter storms, Daniel still remembered that night. The flickering lights. The panic. Lucy struggling to breathe. And the old man pushing a mop bucket through chaos while everyone else overlooked him. Until the moment they needed him. Maybe that was the tragedy. Not that Elliot disappeared, but that it took an emergency for people to recognize his humanity again. And maybe the deeper tragedy was realizing how often that happens everywhere else too. The world notices broken people only when their pain interrupts someone important. But dignity shouldn't require usefulness. Daniel understood that now. Too late for some things. Still in time for others. Lucy kept Elliot's note for years inside a small wooden box beside old birthday cards and photographs. Once, when she was older, she asked Daniel if he thought Elliot ever found peace. Daniel looked out the kitchen window for a long time before answering. "I think," he finally said, "he spent most of his life believing his worst moment erased everything good before it." Lucy waited, and Daniel smiled sadly. "And I hope before he left, he realized at least a few people remembered him differently." Outside, snow drifted slowly across the dark street. Quiet. Steady. The way it had that night. Only now, when Daniel thought about Elliot Hayes, he no longer pictured the janitor uniform first. He remembered the look in his eyes when the room panicked. The certainty. The humanity. A man everyone treated like he didn't exist. Until the moment he reminded them what compassion actually looked like. And maybe that was the part Daniel carried longest. Not guilt, though there was plenty of that. Not admiration either. Gratitude. For the rare people who continue caring for others even after the world stops seeing them. Those people hold more society together than anyone likes admitting. And sometimes they're standing quietly in the corner the whole time. Waiting. Not to be celebrated. Just to be seen. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel for more grounded emotional stories about redemption, hidden lives, and the moments that quietly change people forever. And before you go, answer this in the comments. What do you think of Elliot? Wherever you're watching from, thank you for spending this hour here. And remember, sometimes the people the world notices least are the ones holding everything together.